The morning sun painted the vast Dakota plains in golden hues as Chief Standing Bear walked through his village. The year was 1868, and tension filled the air like smoke from dying campfires. White settlers were pushing deeper into Lakota territory, and the government wanted all native tribes to move to reservations far from their ancestral lands. Standing Bear was a tall man with weathered hands and eyes that held the wisdom of his 43 years. He had seen many seasons change, witnessed countless hunts, and led his people through difficult times. But today, something different weighed on his heart. His closest friend, Running Wolf, had fallen gravely ill 3 days ago. The two men had grown up together, learned to hunt buffalo side by side, and earned their warrior names in the same battle against enemy tribes. Running Wolf was more than a friend to Standing Bear. He was like a brother, someone who understood him without words and stood by him through every challenge their people faced. Running Wolf lived in a lodge at the edge of the village with his wife, White Dove, and their 8-year-old son, Little Eagle. White Dove was known throughout the tribe for her kindness and skill in making beautiful beadwork. She had gentle brown eyes and long black hair that she often braided with colorful ribbons. Little Eagle was a curious boy who followed his father everywhere, eager to learn the ways of a warrior. As Standing Bear approached their lodge, he could hear White Dove's soft voice singing a healing song. The medicine man, Gray Owl, emerged from the lodge shaking his head sadly. His face told Standing Bear everything he needed to know. "My friend fights hard, but the spirits are calling him home," Gray Owl whispered, placing a wrinkled hand on Standing Bear's shoulder. "The fever burns too hot. His body grows weaker with each passing hour." Standing Bear's heart felt heavy as a stone in his chest. He had lost many warriors in battle, but losing Running Wolf felt different. This man had saved his life twice, once from a charging grizzly bear, and another time during a fierce winter storm when Standing Bear had fallen through ice while hunting. He pushed aside the lodge flap and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of burning sage and medicinal herbs. Running Wolf lay on a buffalo hide bed, his once strong body now thin and weak. His breathing came in short, difficult gasps. White Dove sat beside him, gently wiping sweat from his forehead with a soft cloth. When Running Wolf saw Standing Bear, he tried to smile. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "My brother, you came." "Of course I came," Standing Bear replied, kneeling beside his friend. "We have been through too much together for me to be anywhere else." Running Wolf's eyes moved to his wife and son, who sat quietly nearby. Little Eagle held his mother's hand tightly, his young face showing confusion and fear. White Dove kept her expression calm, but Standing Bear could see the pain in her eyes. "I need to tell you something important," Running Wolf struggled to speak. "The soldiers came yesterday while you were hunting. They spoke with several families. They say all Lakota must report to the agency within 1 moon's time. Anyone who refuses will be considered hostile." Standing Bear felt anger rise in his chest like fire. The agency was a government post 300 miles away, in a place where the land was poor and game was scarce. It meant leaving everything their people had known for generations. "What did you tell them?" Standing Bear asked. "I told them nothing. I was too weak to speak." But White Dove heard everything. Running Wolf's eyes moved to his wife. "They said families who cooperate will receive government protection and supplies. Those who resist will face the army." White Dove spoke for the first time since Standing Bear arrived. "They were not asking, husband. They were telling us what we must do." The lodge fell silent except for the crackling of the small fire. Standing Bear understood the impossible choice facing his people: comply and lose their freedom, their traditional way of life, their connection to the land that held the bones of their ancestors. Resist and face the might of the United States Army. Running Wolf gripped Standing Bear's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me something, my brother. Anything. Promise me you will look after White Dove and Little Eagle, not just as their chief, but as their protector. The times ahead will be dangerous for a woman alone with a child." Standing Bear nodded solemnly. "You have my word. They will be as my own family." A weak smile crossed Running Wolf's face. "I knew I could count on you. You have always been a man of honor." That evening, as the sun set behind distant hills, the entire village gathered around Running Wolf's lodge. Drums beat softly, and elders sang ancient songs to help guide a warrior's spirit to the afterlife. Women prepared food for the grieving family, and men shared stories of Running Wolf's bravery and wisdom. Standing Bear sat with other tribal leaders discussing the difficult situation facing their people. Some wanted to fight the government's demands. Others believed cooperation might save lives. The debate grew heated as fear and frustration filled the air. "We cannot win against their army," argued an elder named Crowfeather. "They have too many soldiers, too many guns. Maybe it is better to go to the agency and try to make the best life we can there." "And abandon the graves of our fathers?" responded a young warrior named Black Thunder. "This land is sacred to us. Our spirits belong here. I would rather die fighting than live as prisoners." The argument continued late into the night. Standing Bear listened to both sides but said little. His mind was focused on his dying friend and the promise he had made. He knew that whatever decision the tribe made, his first responsibility was to protect White Dove and Little Eagle. Just before dawn, White Dove's voice called out from the lodge. Those keeping vigil rushed inside. Running Wolf had opened his eyes one last time. He looked at his wife and son, then at Standing Bear. "Take care of them," he whispered, so quietly that only those closest to him could hear. Standing Bear leaned down and placed his hand on his friend's chest. "I will guard them with my life." Running Wolf smiled peacefully, closed his eyes, and drew his last breath. White Dove let out a soft cry and collapsed over her husband's body. Little Eagle began to weep, finally understanding that his father was gone forever. The next 4 days passed in a blur of mourning rituals and preparations for Running Wolf's burial. The entire tribe participated in the ceremonies, honoring a man who had been a skilled hunter, brave warrior, and devoted family man. On the morning after the burial, 2 government officials arrived at the village with a small escort of soldiers. They demanded to speak with the tribal leaders about the relocation order. Standing Bear met them in the center of the village, along with several other chiefs and elders. The lead official was a thin man with cold blue eyes and a permanent frown. He read from an official document in a voice that showed no emotion. "By order of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all Lakota people in this region must report to the Pine Ridge Agency by the next full moon. This is not a request. It is a command from the United States government. And if we refuse?" Standing Bear asked calmly. "Then you will be declared hostile Indians and the army will come to collect you by force. Your cooperation now will make this transition easier for everyone, especially for your women and children." Standing Bear looked around at his people. He saw fear in some faces, anger in others, and resignation in many. These were people who had lived free on these lands for countless generations. Now they were being told to abandon everything and trust their future to a government that had broken treaty after treaty. "We need time to consider your words and make our decision," Standing Bear replied. "You have until the next full moon. That gives you 12 days. The official rolled up his document and prepared to leave. "I strongly advise you not to test the patience of the United States Army." After the officials left, the tribal council met to debate their options. The discussion lasted all day and into the night. Some families began packing their belongings, ready to comply with the government order. Others spoke of fleeing north to Canada or hiding in the Badlands where soldiers would have trouble finding them. Standing Bear found himself torn between his duties as a chief and his promise to his dying friend. As a leader, he needed to consider what was best for all his people. As a friend, he had sworn to protect White Dove and Little Eagle no matter what dangers lay ahead. White Dove herself seemed lost in grief and uncertainty. She had barely spoken since her husband's death, focusing all her attention on comforting Little Eagle and managing her sorrow. She had no close relatives in the tribe, no other family to turn to for guidance or support. On the 3rd day after the government officials' visit, disturbing news arrived from a neighboring tribe. A band of Lakota who had refused to report to an agency had been attacked by cavalry troops. Several warriors were killed, and the survivors were forced to march to a reservation at gunpoint. The news sent shockwaves through Standing Bear's village. The reality of their situation became crystal clear. Resistance meant war, and war against the United States Army meant death for many of their people. That evening, Standing Bear visited White Dove in her lodge. She was teaching Little Eagle how to weave grass into small baskets, trying to keep his mind occupied with familiar tasks. When she saw the chief, she gestured for him to sit by their small fire. "You have been kind to us since my husband's death," she said quietly. "But I know you face difficult choices as our leader. Do not let concern for me and my son influence your decisions for the tribe." Standing Bear studied her face in the firelight. She was trying to be strong, but he could see the fear behind her brave words. Running Wolf was my brother. His family is my family. That will never change no matter what happens to our people." White Dove nodded, blinking back tears. "The other women say we will go to the agency. They say it is the only way to keep our children safe." "And what do you think? I think my husband would want his son to live, even if it means living differently than our ancestors did." She paused, watching Little Eagle concentrate on his weaving. "But I am afraid of what we might face in that strange place, away from everything we know." Standing Bear reached over and placed his hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, you will not face it alone. This I promise you." Over the next few days, more families decided to prepare for the journey to the agency. They began selling or trading possessions they could not carry, packing only the most essential belongings. The atmosphere in the village grew heavy with sadness and uncertainty. Standing Bear found himself facing the hardest decision of his life as a leader. Every choice seemed to lead to loss and suffering for his people. Fighting meant death. Fleeing meant constant danger and hardship. Surrendering meant the end of their traditional way of life. On the 10th day, with only 2 days left before the deadline, Standing Bear made his decision. He called the entire tribe together for one final council meeting. "My people," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "we face a choice between certain death and uncertain life. I have decided that we will go to the agency, but we will not go as defeated people. We will go as Lakota, proud and united, carrying our traditions in our hearts wherever the government sends us." Some nodded in agreement. Others looked disappointed but accepted their chief's judgment. A few young warriors seemed ready to argue, but the weight of recent events had convinced most people that resistance was hopeless. White Dove listened to the decision with mixed emotions. Part of her felt relief that the terrible uncertainty was over. Another part grieved for the life she was leaving behind, the home where she had been happy with Running Wolf, the places that held so many memories. That night, as the village prepared for departure, Standing Bear walked through the camp one last time as a free chief on his ancestral lands. Tomorrow, everything would change forever. He stopped at Running Wolf's grave and spoke quietly to his departed friend. "I will keep my promise, brother. No matter what we face in the days ahead, your family will be safe. This I swear to you," the wind whispered through the prairie grass. And for a moment, Standing Bear felt as if his old friend had heard his words and approved. The morning of departure arrived grey and cold, with autumn winds carrying the scent of changing seasons. Standing Bear's people gathered their possessions and loaded them onto travois pulled by horses and dogs. The sight broke many hearts as families said goodbye to homes they had known all their lives. White Dove packed her few remaining belongings with care. She wrapped Running Wolf's war lance in soft deerskin and placed it among her things, along with his medicine bag and the eagle feather he had earned for bravery in battle. Little Eagle helped by gathering his small collection of toys carved from wood and bone. "Why can't Father come with us?" the boy asked for the 100th time since his father's death. White Dove knelt down and took her son's hands in hers. "Your father's spirit has gone to live with our ancestors in the sky, but he watches over us from there, and his love travels with us wherever we go." Standing Bear approached with his own horse loaded for the journey. He had decided to walk alongside his people rather than ride, sharing in their hardships as a true leader should. His wife, Morningstar, and their 2 teenage children were prepared to travel, but their faces showed the same sadness that marked everyone in the group. The government officials returned with an escort of 20 soldiers to ensure the tribe's compliance with the relocation order. They seemed impatient to begin the long journey to the agency, treating the Lakota like cattle being herded rather than people leaving their homeland. "Form a column and keep moving," the lead officer shouted. "We have a long way to go, and winter is coming. Anyone who falls behind will be left behind." Standing Bear felt anger boil in his chest at the man's harsh words, but he kept his emotions controlled. He had learned that dealing with white officials required patience and careful diplomacy. Losing his temper would only make things worse for his people. The procession began slowly, with over 200 men, women, and children making their way across the familiar prairie. Many looked back at their village one last time, knowing they would never see it again. Some of the older people wept openly, while others maintained stoic expressions that hid their breaking hearts. White Dove walked near the middle of the group, carrying a bundle of essential supplies while Little Eagle rode on a gentle mare. Standing Bear made sure to check on them regularly, remembering his promise to Running Wolf. The widow seemed determined to be strong for her son's sake, but the chief could see exhaustion in her eyes even on the first day. By afternoon, the group had covered only 10 miles. The elderly and small children were already showing signs of fatigue, and several people needed to rest frequently. The soldiers grew increasingly impatient with the slow pace. "At this rate, we'll be traveling all winter," complained the sergeant in charge of the escort. "Tell these people they need to move faster." Standing Bear approached the officer calmly. "Many of our people are old or sick. The children cannot walk as fast as grown men. We will keep moving, but we must rest when needed. The government wants you at the agency quickly. Every day we delay costs money and resources. Would the government prefer to deliver dead Indians to the agency?" Standing Bear asked quietly. "Because that is what will happen if you push too hard." The sergeant scowled but seemed to understand the logic of the chief's words. He agreed to allow regular rest stops but made it clear that any delays would not be tolerated. That first night, the tribe camped in a shallow valley beside a small stream. The air grew colder as darkness fell, and people huddled around small fires trying to stay warm. Many had been forced to leave behind their winter lodge covers and heavy blankets, so the night was miserable for everyone. White Dove set up her small shelter near Standing Bear's family. Morning Star helped to arrange a comfortable sleeping area for Little Eagle, who was already shivering in the cold wind. The two women worked together quietly, their friendship providing some comfort in the midst of so much uncertainty. "How many days until we reach the agency?" White Dove asked. Morning Star shook her head sadly. "Standing Bear thinks perhaps 20 days if the weather stays good. Longer if we face snow or storms." The thought of 3 more weeks of travel under these conditions seemed almost impossible to White Dove. She worried about her son's health and wondered if they would have enough food to last the entire journey. The government officials had promised supplies along the way, but she had learned not to trust such promises. During the second day of travel, problems began to multiply. An elderly man named Three Bears collapsed from exhaustion and could not continue walking. 2 children developed fever and coughs that worried their parents. Several horses went lame, forcing their owners to carry heavy loads on their backs. Standing Bear found himself constantly moving up and down the column, helping where he could, and trying to keep spirits up. He carried water to those who needed it, helped repair broken travois, and shared his own food with families who were running short. The soldiers showed little sympathy for the struggling people. When Three Bears could not walk, they suggested leaving him behind. Only Standing Bear's firm intervention convinced them to allow the old man to ride on one of the supply wagons. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the sergeant told Standing Bear during an evening discussion. "These people need to learn that their old ways are finished. The sooner they accept that, the easier things will be. These people are human beings, not animals." Standing Bear replied firmly. "They deserve to be treated with dignity, especially during such a difficult time." The sergeant's expression showed he disagreed, but he seemed to recognize that Standing Bear was not someone he could easily intimidate or dismiss. By the 5th day, White Dove was struggling to keep up with the group. She had given most of her food to Little Eagle, leaving herself weak and hungry. Her feet were blistered from walking in thin moccasins over rough ground, and she had developed a persistent cough from sleeping in the cold night air. Standing Bear noticed her condition during the morning preparations to move out. He approached her quietly so others would not hear and feel embarrassed for her. "You are not well," he observed gently. "I am fine," she insisted. But her pale face and unsteady movements told a different story. Without asking permission, Standing Bear took her heavy bundle and added it to his own load. Little Eagle needs his mother to be strong. Accept help when it is offered. White Dove felt tears come to her eyes at his kindness. Since Running Wolf's death, she had tried so hard to manage everything alone that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care for her welfare. "Thank you," she whispered. Standing Bear also arranged for her to ride his horse for part of each day, alternating with other people who needed rest. Some of the other women began sharing their food with White Dove, understanding that a widow with a young child faced special hardships. The weather turned worse during the second week of travel. Cold rain fell for 3 straight days, soaking everyone to the skin and turning the trail into thick mud. The group could only cover a few miles each day, and many people began showing signs of illness. Little Eagle developed a high fever and could barely stay conscious. White Dove was terrified that she might lose her son just as she had lost her husband. She carried the boy in her arms when he was too weak to ride, even though her own strength was nearly gone. Standing Bear watched the situation with growing anger at the government officials who had forced this journey during the worst possible time of year. He saw proud, strong people reduced to misery and desperation by policies that showed no consideration for human suffering. On the 10th night of travel, disaster struck. A winter storm moved in unexpectedly, bringing heavy snow and howling winds. The temperature dropped far below freezing, and the tribe found themselves trapped in an open area with no shelter from the blizzard. People huddled together in small groups, sharing blankets and body warmth to survive. Several of the oldest and youngest members of the group were in serious danger from the extreme cold. Little Eagle's fever worsened, and White Dove feared he might not survive until morning. Standing Bear made a desperate decision. He approached the soldiers' camp, where the men had set up large military tents and were burning plenty of firewood to stay warm. "My people need shelter," he told the sergeant. "The children and elders will die if they spend the night exposed to this storm." "We don't have room for everyone," the sergeant replied without looking up from his warm fire. "Then make room for the most vulnerable ones. The children at least deserve a chance to live." After some argument, the soldiers agreed to allow the smallest children and sickest adults to crowd into one of their supply tents. It was not much, but it might mean the difference between life and death for some of the tribe's most fragile members. White Dove was among those allowed into the tent with Little Eagle. She held her feverish son close to her body, sharing what little warmth she had while praying to the spirits to spare his life. Around her, other mothers did the same with their children, creating a scene of quiet desperation and fierce love. Standing Bear spent the night moving between the various groups of his people, checking on everyone and offering what encouragement he could. He found families sharing their last blankets with neighbors, strong men giving their food to hungry children, and people supporting each other through the worst night of their lives. When morning came, the storm had passed, but its damage was severe. 2 elderly people had died during the night, and several others were too sick to continue traveling. The soldiers insisted that the group must keep moving regardless of these tragedies. "We can't wait for people to recover," the sergeant declared. "The agency is expecting you, and we have orders to deliver you on schedule." Standing Bear felt his patience finally reach its breaking point. These are human beings who have just lost family members. They deserve time to mourn and bury their dead with dignity. The dead are dead. The living need to keep moving. The confrontation might have turned violent, but White Dove approached and placed a gentle hand on Standing Bear's arm. Her son's fever had broken during the night, and she had been watching the argument with concern. "My husband would not want you to risk everything for the sake of ceremony," she said quietly. "He would want you to focus on getting the living people to safety." Her words reminded Standing Bear of his larger responsibilities. He was not just avenging the disrespect shown to his people. He was trying to keep them alive long enough to reach their destination. The burials were brief and simple, but Standing Bear made sure they were conducted according to Lakota tradition. The tribe sang death songs and offered prayers for the departed souls. Then, with heavy hearts, they resumed their painful journey toward an uncertain future. White Dove walked beside Standing Bear that day, her son riding on the chief's horse. Little Eagle was weak but alive, and his mother felt a small spark of hope that they might actually survive this ordeal. "How much farther?" she asked. Standing Bear looked at the endless horizon ahead of them. "Perhaps 10 more days, if we can keep moving and avoid more storms." 10 more days seemed like an eternity, but White Dove nodded and kept walking. She had no choice but to endure whatever hardships lay ahead. Her son needed her to be strong, and she would not let him down. The remaining days of travel passed in a blur of exhaustion, hunger, and cold. People shared what little they had, helped those who stumbled, and found strength they did not know they possessed. Slowly, painfully, the group continued moving toward the government agency that represented both salvation and the end of life as they had known it. Standing Bear kept his promise to Running Wolf, staying close to White Dove and Little Eagle, making sure they had food and shelter each night, and giving them hope when despair threatened to overwhelm them. But he also watched as his people suffered through each difficult day, and he began to wonder what kind of life awaited them at their destination. The Pine Ridge Agency appeared on the horizon like a mirage after 18 grueling days of travel. Standing Bear's people looked at the collection of wooden buildings, military barracks and government offices with mixed emotions. Relief at finally reaching their destination battled with grief for everything they had left behind. White Dove held Little Eagle's hand tightly as they approached the agency grounds. Her son had recovered from his fever but remained weak and thin from the difficult journey. She herself had lost considerable weight and developed a persistent cough that worried those around her. Agent Morrison, the man in charge of Pine Ridge, greeted the arriving Lakota with barely concealed irritation. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the attitude of someone who viewed his assignment as a burden rather than a responsibility. "You're 3 days late," he announced to Standing Bear. "We expected you earlier." "We traveled as quickly as conditions allowed," Standing Bear replied calmly. "My people have endured great hardships to reach this place." Morrison looked over the exhausted group with obvious disdain. "Well, you're here now." "We have barracks assignments and work details prepared. Everyone will be expected to contribute to the maintenance and operation of this facility." The barracks turned out to be long, narrow buildings with thin walls and no privacy. Families were assigned small spaces separated only by hanging blankets. White Dove found herself sharing a corner area with an elderly woman named Singing Bird and her granddaughter. The conditions were harsh and unfamiliar. The buildings were cold, drafty, and overcrowded. The food provided by the government was unfamiliar and often spoiled. People who had lived free on the open plains now found themselves confined to a small area, dependent on government officials for their most basic needs. Standing Bear was given a small room in the chief's quarters, but he spent most of his time moving among his people, checking on families and trying to resolve the countless problems that arose each day. The adjustment to agency life was difficult for everyone, but especially hard for the elderly and the children. White Dove struggled more than most. Her cough worsened in the damp, crowded barracks, and she had trouble eating the unfamiliar government rations. Little Eagle seemed lost and confused, missing his father and the freedom of their old life on the plains. After 2 weeks at the agency, White Dove collapsed while working in the agency's laundry facility. The government required all adults to perform assigned jobs, and she had been struggling to wash heavy loads of clothing despite her weakening condition. Standing Bear found her lying on the floor of the laundry building, barely conscious and burning with fever. He carried her back to the barracks and sent for the agency doctor, a tired-looking man who seemed overwhelmed by the health problems of the reservation population. "She has pneumonia," the doctor diagnosed after a brief examination. "Her lungs are badly infected. I can give her some medicine, but her condition is serious." The medicine was expensive, and the agency required payment before providing it. Standing Bear had no money, having been forced to abandon most of his possessions during the journey. Agent Morrison made it clear that charity medical care was not provided to Indians who could not pay. Standing Bear faced an impossible situation. The woman he had sworn to protect was dying, but he had no resources to save her. He spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution, watching White Dove grow weaker while Little Eagle sat beside her, not understanding why another parent was being taken from him. On the third night of White Dove's illness, Standing Bear made a decision that would change everything. He had heard rumors of a wealthy rancher named Thompson, who lived 50 miles from the agency. Thompson was known to pay well for horses, and Standing Bear still owned the magnificent stallion that had been his companion for many years. The horse was more than just an animal to Standing Bear. It was a symbol of his status as a chief, a connection to his warrior past, and one of the few possessions that linked him to his former life. Selling it would be like selling a part of his soul. But Running Wolf's dying words echoed in his memory. "Promise me you will look after White Dove and Little Eagle." He had given his word to his closest friend, and that promise meant more to him than any material possession. The next morning, Standing Bear approached Agent Morrison with his plan. "I want to sell my horse to buy medicine for the sick woman." Morrison looked surprised. He knew the value of Standing Bear's stallion, and the importance such animals held for the Lakota people. "That's a valuable horse. You could get good money for it, but I can't let you leave the reservation without an escort." "Then provide an escort. I will pay whatever fee you require." Morrison considered the request. He was curious to see how far this proud chief would go to help a widow who was not even his relative. "Very well. I'll arrange for a guard to accompany you to Thompson's ranch. But if you try to escape, both you and the woman will face serious consequences." Standing Bear nodded his agreement. That afternoon, he saddled his beloved stallion one last time and rode out from the agency accompanied by a young soldier named Private Jenkins. The horse seemed to sense that something important was happening, stepping proudly despite the somber nature of the journey. The ride to Thompson's ranch took them through rolling hills and open grasslands that reminded Standing Bear of his homeland. For a few hours, he could almost imagine he was free again, riding across Lakota territory on a hunting expedition or journey to visit neighboring tribes. Thompson's ranch was impressive, with a large house, numerous outbuildings, and corrals filled with cattle and horses. The rancher himself was a tall, sunburned man who clearly knew the value of good livestock when he saw it. "That's a fine animal you have there," Thompson said, walking around Standing Bear's stallion and examining its build and condition. "Strong legs, good chest, clear eyes." "What are you asking for him?" "I need $200 to buy medicine for a sick woman," Standing Bear replied honestly. Thompson raised his eyebrows. $200 is a lot of money. "This horse is worth it. But I'm curious why a Lakota chief is so desperate for cash that he'd sell such a valuable animal." Standing Bear explained the situation, describing White Dove's illness and his promise to her dying husband. Thompson listened with growing interest, apparently impressed by the chief's dedication to keeping his word. "I'll give you $250 for the horse," Thompson offered. "Any man willing to sacrifice something this precious to help a friend's widow deserves a fair price." The transaction was completed quickly, with Thompson counting out the money in gold coins and Standing Bear formally transferring ownership of his stallion. As he watched the rancher lead the horse toward a corral, Standing Bear felt a deep sense of loss but also relief that he would soon be able to help White Dove. The return journey to the agency seemed much longer on foot. Private Jenkins rode his own horse while Standing Bear walked, carrying the precious gold coins in a leather pouch. His feet were sore and his body tired, but his spirit felt lighter, knowing that he had found a way to honor his promise to Running Wolf. When they reached Pine Ridge, Standing Bear went immediately to Agent Morrison's office to purchase the medicine. Morrison seemed surprised that the chief had actually gone through with the sale, and perhaps impressed by his dedication to helping another person. "The doctor says this medicine should help fight the infection in her lungs," Morrison explained as he handed over the expensive bottles. "But there's no guarantee it will work. She's been sick for several days now." Standing Bear hurried to the barracks where White Dove lay dying. Little Eagle sat beside his mother, holding her hand and singing softly to comfort her. The boy looked up hopefully when he saw the chief approaching with medicine. "Will this make Mother better?" Little Eagle asked. "We will do everything possible to help her," Standing Bear promised. He administered the first dose of medicine immediately and continued giving it to White Dove according to the doctor's instructions. For 2 days, her condition remained critical, with high fever and labored breathing that frightened everyone who saw her. On the 3rd day, the fever finally broke. White Dove opened her eyes and asked for water, the first coherent words she had spoken since collapsing. Little Eagle wept with joy, and Standing Bear felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The recovery was slow but steady. White Dove gradually regained her strength, though she remained weak for many weeks. The medicine had saved her life, but the illness had taken a permanent toll on her health. She would never again be as strong as she had been before. Pneumonia nearly killed her. During her recovery, White Dove learned about Standing Bear's sacrifice. Other people in the barracks told her how he had sold his prized stallion to buy the expensive medicine that saved her life. When she was strong enough to speak with him privately, she wept as she thanked him. "You gave up something precious to save me," she said, her voice still weak but filled with emotion. "I can never repay such a gift." "Your husband was my brother," Standing Bear replied simply. "His family is my family. I would make the same choice again without hesitation." Little Eagle, who was old enough to understand the significance of what Standing Bear had done, appointed himself as the chief's devoted helper. He followed Standing Bear around the agency, eager to assist with any task, and determined to somehow repay the man who had saved his mother's life. The story of Standing Bear's sacrifice spread throughout the reservation community. Other Lakota families, struggling with their own hardships, found inspiration in their chief's example. His willingness to give up something so valuable for the sake of keeping a promise reminded them of the traditional values that defined their people. Agent Morrison, despite his general lack of sympathy for the Indians under his authority, seemed to develop a grudging respect for Standing Bear. He began consulting the chief on various reservation matters and showed more flexibility in dealing with problems that arose among the Lakota population. As winter settled over Pine Ridge, conditions remained difficult for all the displaced families. The buildings were inadequately heated, food was often scarce, and many people fell ill from the poor living conditions. But the community that had formed among Standing Bear's people helped everyone endure the hardships. White Dove slowly recovered her strength and found ways to contribute to the survival of her small community. She taught other women how to make traditional medicines from the few plants that grew near the agency. She helped care for children whose parents were sick, and she worked with Standing Bear to resolve disputes that arose in the overcrowded barracks. Little Eagle grew stronger and more mature as the months passed. The loss of his father and his mother's near-death experience had aged him beyond his years, but he also developed a deep understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and the importance of keeping one's promises. Spring brought some improvement to conditions at Pine Ridge. Better weather meant better health for many residents, and garden plots were established where families could grow some of their own food. White Dove planted a small vegetable garden and taught Little Eagle how to tend the growing plants. One evening, as Standing Bear walked through the agency grounds checking on various families, he stopped to visit White Dove and her son. They were sitting outside their barracks building, enjoying the warm weather and watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors. "Do you ever regret your decision to sell your horse?" White Dove asked quietly. Standing Bear considered the question carefully. He thought about his magnificent stallion, now living on Thompson's ranch 50 miles away. He remembered the freedom and pride he had felt riding across the plains of his homeland. But then he looked at White Dove, healthy and alive, and at Little Eagle growing into a fine young man who would carry on his father's legacy. "A horse, no matter how beautiful, is just an animal," he said finally. "But a promise made to a dying friend is sacred. I chose to honor something eternal over something temporary. That is not a decision any man should regret." White Dove smiled, understanding that Standing Bear's sacrifice had been about more than just saving her life. It had been about maintaining the values that defined the Lakota people, even in the face of overwhelming hardship and loss. Years later, when Little Eagle had grown to manhood and started a family of his own, he would tell his children the story of the great chief who had risked everything to save their grandmother. The tale would become part of the family's oral history, passed down through generations as an example of honor, loyalty, and the power of keeping one's word, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Standing Bear's sacrifice had saved more than just White Dove's life. It had preserved the spirit of brotherhood and mutual support that had always been at the heart of Lakota society. In a place designed to destroy their traditional culture, his actions had demonstrated that some values were too important to abandon, regardless of the circumstances. The bond between Standing Bear and White Dove's family endured for the rest of their lives. He continued to watch over them as he had promised Running Wolf, and they remained devoted to him in return. Together they created a small island of traditional Lakota values in the harsh environment of the government reservation, proving that the human spirit could survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it.